of teachers, school administrators, policymakers, nonprofit leaders, and other education professionals is fraught with ethical challenges. For instance, teachers and school leaders must regularly decide how to allocate scarce resources, including their own time, to students whose needs may well outstrip what's available. At the policy level, legislators must also figure out how to balance competing values. In recent debates over the wisdom of state takeovers of schools and school districts deemed failing, for example, legislators must weigh the relative priority of, on the one hand, democratic participation in local school politics, and on the other hand, student achievement. Notably, these debates are made even more challenging by virtue of the fact that different stakeholders hold competing conceptions of a value like achievement. While some of the ethical challenges we face are avoidable, teachers shouldn't have to choose, say, between buying classroom supplies and paying rent, for instance. Ethical complexity should not be understood as inevitably being somebody's fault or the result of some preventable mistake. Rather, we often face ethical challenges because education is itself a fundamentally value-laden enterprise. We disagree about the meaning of equity, what it looks like to run an inclusive classroom, the proper role of community values in setting education policy. In many cases, these disagreements aren't a failure of a moral imagination on our part, but are rather simply a part of our being a member of a diverse, pluralistic democracy. Education professionals, therefore, need to learn to reason about values and to manage reasonable moral disagreement. Whether or not we're aware of it, we're surrounded by ethical complexity in schools. However, this ethical complexity isn't always or even frequently acknowledged in practice. When I was a teacher in 8th grade classrooms, for example, I often wrestled with what I should do, say, when I had a student who had a lot of needs and needed a lot of my attention, but if I gave her that attention, I had other students who would end up getting distracted, floundering, going off on their wrong directions. I would wonder, when I was trying to figure out how to keep my classroom in control, and I might say, give a note to a student, say, hey, can you take this to Miss Smith, please? There was no note actually in the envelope, right? Many of you probably did this, and I would think, finally, we get 10 minutes really to focus in. But I was painfully aware that that student who spent that 10 minutes doing the errand simply to get that child out of my class, they weren't learning what they needed to learn. I would also wrestle with these questions on a curricular level. Should I really spend time teaching the War of 1812, which I actually didn't think mattered very much because I knew it was on the state test? Or should I spend time, say, following my students' own interests in climate change or in a local election because I believed actually that was achieving our aims better, say, of helping to prepare citizens, but where then they might actually do worse on the test, and that might actually be a problem for them and for me as I was being evaluated as well. When we fail to recognize these kinds of ethical complexities, we risk making decisions that don't live up to our own ethical principles or values. And when this happens often, we risk the demoralization that can come from feeling that we've done something wrong without having the language or the space to address why we feel this way. This is where the normative case study comes into play. Normative case studies are richly described, realistic accounts of value-laden, commonly challenging dilemmas in which one or more identifiable protagonists must decide among courses of action, none of which is self-evidently the right one to take. Normative case studies aim to support the development of ethical judgment by offering education professionals space to discuss authentic ethical dilemmas outside of the classroom or school or policy space, where decisions must often be made in the heat of the moment. To develop this judgment, cases need to be authentic to help education professionals connect their developing ethical sensitivity to the kinds of decisions they will actually face in the real world. In other words, these are not the kinds of ethical thought experiments that students play with, say, in undergraduate philosophy classes. Rather, these are richly detailed dramatizations of the kinds of ethical challenges that regularly occur in the professional lives of educators. In future units, we'll talk much more about developing authentic normative case studies. But for now, we're going to zoom in on exercising judgment in the classroom. To start, let's listen to a fellow educator talk about an ethical dilemma that has arisen for her and what questions these raised for her own ethical judgment. Afterward, we'll invite you to reflect on ethical challenges that have arisen in your own professional practice.